So now that we learned a little bit about like minor injury makeup and silicone, I want to talk about bruises. I think probably like the most common thing as far as like injury makeup in theater goes, other than like small like blood moments and like blood gags and stuff, I think you're gonna run into having to do a lot of bruises. A lot of times you've got like 30 seconds to do this, so it might just be like a couple of colors on the eye, and you're good to go. Other times I've had shows where I had to completely like I had to put a ton of bruises like from head to toe on someone. Sometimes you have to do those pre-show so you have more time. Other times, like I had to put bruises on this person like in the dark backstage with like a little tiny like bite light, so you never really know the situation that you might be in when you have to do stuff like this. So I think it's good to know how to do like a quick like theater bruise, as well as like understanding how like a realistic bruise would go for the times where you might have more time. And also it's just good to know like the different stages of bruises. So if you're doing a bruise that's fresher, like somebody just got hit or something, then it's going to be a lot like redder, and then it's going to sort of start transitioning into like the purples and the blues, and then as something ages it's going to get more greenish and yellow, and then it gets a little bit closer to skin tone. So this also kind of depends on what your skin tone is as well. Like somebody's pale as me, like I might have really brightly colored bruises, like they could be like sky blue, more of like a vibrant green, whereas like deeper skin tones, a lot of times I found that the bruises are usually a lot more like reddish based, and a lot of times they actually look a little bit more like skin tone for a majority of the time, depending on how deep somebody's skin tone is. So you always need to like research actual bruises and like actual things so that you know that what you're doing is realistic. So know that first. You have to understand like where they got the bruise, so that when you put the makeup on, it like makes sense that like, you know, if they got hit like in the eye, you're not like bruising it down here or something. Think about where they got hit, but then also think about like the time that's passed since they got the injury. Like bruises will travel as they heal, because the blood is sort of like going down and draining. So like I worked on someone once who had like an actual bruise, and like the impact was like here, but their entire neck ended up bruising, just because it just kind of travels down. So if you are like working on like a film, or it's like a show that like follows somebody through a period of time after an injury, you have to make sure that you're like accounting for that and altering that as much as time will allow for. So like always kind of keep that kind of stuff in mind. If you only have a little bit of time, I think using some sort of like a burgundy color, so it's like a little bit red, a little bit purplish, that will usually get the point across, and it's usually deep enough to see when you're on stage. So if I did do like a super quick kind of bruise makeup, and like I'm backstage and only have like 2 seconds or something, I'm gonna use this burgundy color. This is like my like instant injury color, is what I usually call it. So if somebody's supposed to have just sort of like a black eye or something, but you only have, you know, 30 seconds, 10 seconds or something to do it, I think using this kind of a color, and what I love about this kind of a color is that on most skin tones this is going to show up, because it is, it's deep, but it's also kind of like vibrant at the same time, and usually with any kind of an eye injury it's going to carry over onto the nose a little bit too, and I actually think with bruises, sometimes not having a ton of time to do it, you might be better off, because then you can't like overdo it. So I think usually if you just end up, you obviously like this part, because this is where we're darkest the most anyway, under eyes, this is probably going to be like the darkest, and then you're going to have like a little bit on the nose, usually like the outer part of the eye will get it a little bit, and then right on this cheek, if you do a little bit like right under here, and then if there's a little like above that, that can help it look sort of like puffier too. And so again, you may not even have as much time as I'm taking right now to do it, but I think if you can just get some of this color onto the face in like some way, and I don't think it has to just be like on the eyes, you could use this for a bruise anywhere. I use this is like what I put on the inside of this cut when I first did it. This kind of a color, I think it just kind of, I don't know, I call it, like I said, like I call it sort of my like instant injury color, and I also think it's good when you do bruises to sort of like make it like a little bit blotchier and have some spots where it like picks up a little bit stronger, just because when you get bruises there's so many different colors, and like you almost see like not necessarily like textures, but because there's so many like light and dark colors in it, it looks like a little bit more textured, and I think having that in the makeup are using like a stipple sponge or something to put it on, or I've even seen people like press paper towel into it. That could really help. But that's something you could do this really quickly. If you sent somebody out on stage like this, obviously the audience is going to know that they're injured. That's just one color. Is it the most accurate like color in the world? No. It's not going to be appropriate for everything, but if this is the only chance you have, it's going to get the point across and people are going to understand. And most of the time in theater, that's really what you're trying to achieve, is to just like have people get an idea, and you're just trying to translate something across. So not always going for the most realistic. Sometimes it's just enough to get the point across. If you have a little bit more time and you're doing any kind of a bruise, I think black eyes are usually the most common, or bruising around the eye. So we'll do a little of that. I usually like to start most bruises with this sort of like golden yellow color, which I usually like refer to as my like special effects highlight color, just because I think this sort of a color is what our skin kind of does when it is injured. And I also think it works well on deeper skin tones to like bring out a little bit more of a highlight when there might not be one that's as apparent. And again, whether you're using like a brush, so this is just kind of like a crease brush for eyeshadow that I like for this kind of stuff, or a sponge, you just kind of put it on sort of randomly, and that will help it look a little bit more realistic. And so let's go ahead, we'll do one that's like sort of aging, since this would be like a little bit fresher. So I'm going to put little bits of green, and usually I just kind of, my thing with any kind of effects makeup and with most makeup in general is that I just put it on and then I worry about blending it out once it's sort of like placed where I want it. And even if I am working with a brush, which often when I'm around the eyes I do, because I think it's a little bit easier than trying to get like a sponge. Otherwise, if you do have a sponge, you just have to be a little bit lighter around the eye than you probably would be on other parts of the face or other parts of the body, and you pretty much, just to blend it, you are just going to sort of like press it into the skin just like you would anything else that you're blending. And so trying to do like an aged bruise for stage I think is a little bit trickier, and you're probably going to have to make it a little bit darker than what you would if it was going to be for like film or TV or something, because if I was on TV and a camera was going to be really close to me, you'd be able to pick up these kinds of colors, but from further away you're just not necessarily going to see stuff like that. So that could be when you also come in with sort of like a reddish kind of a brown color, and again you just sort of like build up in certain areas. The only color I would say I never really use on black eyes is actually using black. I think depending on like the depth of someone's skin tone, maybe you would end up having to use it, but I think the most I've ever done is I will like mix a little bit of black with like a really deep purple or really deep blue, and I actually feel like sometimes that helps it look a little bit more realistic than putting like pure black. Even if you're like you are trying to get your point across or something, I would much rather see someone go out with colors like this for like a black eye than have a bunch of black around it, because that I mean that could look like clown-like. I just sometimes think that that looks like a little bit too comical, and so I would always say you can make it super super dark, but always mix something, I feel like, into the black, and that's going to get you like a more realistic kind of effect. And so the more you add this color, the more you can kind of deepen it. And with bruises, you always want to leave like parts of the skin, like the skin tone showing. I think that's really, really important, because if you look at bruises, you can usually kind of see through them. They're pretty translucent. That's one reason I like to use alcohol paints a lot. However, if I'm on somebody's eye, I do not like to use alcohol paints, just because they're really drying. I know some people will, but I am not one of those people. If you're ever trying to make like it looks swollen, like that face looks swollen, and you don't have a prosthetic, because a lot of times in theater too, you're not working with prosthetics. If you kind of like shade around like a lighter area, like I put a little bit of yellow on this so that it would like pop a little bit more from further away, that's gonna help that look a little bit puffier. But realistically though, if you want like a really like kind of swollen like puffy eye look, I mean, unless they're just gonna hold it the whole time while they're acting, you would need a prosthetic or something over it, but you can kind of fake it in areas like this. Or you could even, like, I've seen people, this is where I would see them, like, take paper towel, press it into it, that kind of pulls up some of the color, that can help. If we want to, like, make this look So if this is supposed to be more aged, this is probably pretty good for theater. If we want to add a little bit more color to it, a little bit more intense, I can take a little stipple sponge to it. And what's nice with the stipple sponge is it's not going to put any of the colors too close to each other, so it's less likely that it's going to kind of like smush everything together in like a more blended, like non-realistic way. And then sometimes what's good for theater is, especially with like that larger pore stipple sponge, is that it makes like bigger spots, so it's going to be more of an impact from further away. So that's one way you could add it on. Around the eyes, I'm usually using some kind of a brush. If you really want to deepen it, you can start adding in like purples and things. Usually I try to keep that more to like this area of the eye, and then I'll do a little bit in some spots, but again, you're just going to see like there's just certain spots in the skin that just pick up darker than others, and I just never try to like force shadows, so I just try to go with those and just kind of let it like turn into whatever it kind of wants to be. And so you can kind of just sit here, make this as dark as you would like. So probably the deepest color, I'll kind of show you really quick on the inner part, that I would ever add in is like this really great deep blue. And you can see adding this, that's very dark. It's this really great color that's in Krylon's Black Eye Wheel that they have. So I like this color a lot, but you can see that just putting a little bit of that really makes a big difference, and it can make it a lot darker, a lot faster. So you do need to be careful with this kind of stuff, because what can happen is that you'll get too much of it kind of concentrated in one area, and especially when you're working with creams, they all start to kind of like blur and blend together. And so you just want to make sure that you're keeping highlights in there. If you ever have to, you could go in with even like a little bit. If I needed to make it a little brighter, I could take a little bit of yellow and go in there. Maybe I'd make this a little bit yellowy. I kind of just feel like a yellow color, that's kind of just like what our skin naturally does when it's a little bit injured, so that's why I like to include it in makeups like this. You could use powders for this kind of stuff. If you're only going to use powders, I would definitely put setting spray over it. For something like this, when this was done, I would want to set it with a powder, especially around the eyes, because around the eyes is when you're really going to see things like crease and move around, and then I would like to use setting spray at the end just to kind of like make sure that everything stays in place. But this is sort of one of those things that you really could kind of just like go back and forth, and I'll add a little bit of the burgundy to it, but you do just have to be careful, because I do feel like bruises get to a point, especially with like creams, where they just all start to like blur together. And so you could, if you're worried about that happening and you do have to use a lot of different colors, you could always like powder in between layers. That's an option you could do too, just to make sure that everything doesn't blur too much together. And I think with this one, we're pretty much at that point now. But you have to remember too, from theater, everyone's going to see it from a lot farther away, so what might seem really dramatic up close when I'm super far away on stage, it's not going to seem that bad. But pretty much like this kind of stuff, the method I use to apply it, the colors, that applies to like anywhere that you're doing bruises. It's a really good idea. Always test this stuff first. Test it under the light that you're going to see it in, because right now I have a light like right on me, but when you're on stage, if it's really, really dark, you might have to add in highlights that you wouldn't have to add in if someone was seeing it this way. And if it's really, really like bright when they're on stage, you might have to deepen areas that you wouldn't necessarily think that you have to deepen, just to have it look like something and to look more realistic. But hopefully that helps make bruises make a little bit more sense, and is helping you kind of in figuring out injury makeup for theater.